You mentioned the pandemic. I know I'm skipping way, way, way into the future, but people can read your wonderful book to get the kind of the timeline and the history that you trace this through. But just to bring it to kind of our current context, these fault lines were really evident, I think, in the pandemic, and who was deemed essentially as sacrificial to continue their labor to keep our capitalist structure afloat in the midst of this major shock. And I'll never forget hearing, what was it, Ken Paxton, the attorney general in Texas. Was he the attorney general? I forget. Essentially saying that grandmas should be sacrificing themselves for the good of their children and keeping work going, even when we had only been shut down for a few weeks at that point. But the people that it was Dan Patrick. Sorry, Lieutenant Governor, not the Attorney General. My apologies. But from Texas at that point, that was really a real drive, and the people that were on the front lines of that were often the Black working class. How central was that period to your the impulse for you to write this book?
Yeah, I was writing during the pandemic, and so many essential workers were Black workers. Black workers are overrepresented in the ranks of essential workers by about double the population. They were not able to figure out what was going on. They couldn't shelter in place. They just kept working. So many of the women that I am at church with are CNAs. They work in hospitals. They were, food prep. They were postal workers. They didn't have any time away. They just kept working. There was no break for them, even as we didn't even understand exactly what we were facing. And so that profound sacrifice that working people had to make in that time period, went unrecognized. There was no big recognition of what they had done. And it it's a continuation of this longer history. The unequal burden borne by working people in this country just continues to be unrecognized. And so for me, writing this book at that time was just such a reminder that it's past time for us to recognize what working people do.
Yeah, and what does the recognition look like in terms of moving beyond recognition and into say reparations, but also wage increases and like a collective understanding of what we're putting a working class through to work 3 minimum wage jobs to survive, for example, in many states.
I'm so excited to see so many folks going on strike, so many folks thinking about labor differently. My generation basically was told over and over again that labor unions were bad for people. When I studied these labor unions, these Black labor unions in my book, I discovered that labor unions were concerned about the country as a whole. They're not just concerned about an hourly wage or better benefits for the folks that they are representing, but they're really calling the question of what workers deserve. They deserve healthcare. They deserve pay time off. They deserve living wages. They deserve to be able to live in homes near the places where they work. Our country can do much better when it comes to workers of all backgrounds. And Black workers and the history of Black workers is a reminder that workers have the wisdom to know what they need and to demand it. And then we should start listening as a country.
What was your reaction to some of the coverage of these strikes too? And when we're getting the tropes of the working class, I guess, coming back to the fore and who is working class and who is not, the portrayed image of the auto worker, for example, versus the reality and the diversity of the auto worker. And the solidarity shown, honestly, cross-racially in these massive strikes, which is inspiring and bridging many of the divides, I would say, that you talk about.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Even the actors unions have done a fine job of really, unearthing the exploitation that's at the center of their work. The auto workers, the UPS strike. People tried to come back like, well, UPS workers shouldn't be making $70,000 a year. But when we think about $70,000 a year in many places in the country, that's just breaking through where you might be able to afford to live there and afford to, raise a family. And so why do we continue to push this idea that working people shouldn't be able to live in the places where they do their labor? We owe everyone so much more. And so I'm glad to see that all these union conversations have really been forcing us to think again about what workers are doing, and they're breaking the silence and I think the stereotypes about organized labor that have been pushed by folks who don't want to see it.
Can you talk more about the domestic labor too, and how that plays into some of the preconceived notions about who is working class and who is not?
What was powerful for me was to see that the domestic workers, folks who clean people's houses, wash their kids, cook in their homes, it was a burst of those women, Black women who were doing that labor in the mid 20th century. I like to say Rosie the Riveter had a maid. So often we were thinking about the white women who were able to get federal jobs in the Second World War. Black women were, for the most part, and there were exceptions, but for the most part, not able to get access to those jobs without protest and without years of rallying to get access. And so the jobs that they got were in white households in that time period that were unprotected by the same
Yes.
federal jobs recognitions that everyone else had. And they continue to be unprotected by federal legislation. And we're still fighting to make sure that domestic workers have these right to organize, can be covered by the same basic things like an 8-hour workday and breaks and time off that everyone else can benefit from. This cutout that was, created by segregationists more than 100 years ago can't still stand. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really profound to think about it. But, we have to do better. We have to continue to call the question of, what does this labor look like, and how essential is it? And it's not something we can outsource. It's not something robots can do. The care of our elders, the care of our homes, the care of our children is valuable work. And why aren't we paying a living wage?
It is incredibly important to point that out. I mean, given the fact that Gavin Newsom a few weeks ago, 2 months ago or so, vetoed expanded workplace protections for domestic workers in California. Like, this is a problem that crosses party lines. And
It does.
some of the things that you talk about, what domestic workers have had to go through with that little, the threadbare or non-existent protection from the government, is like, wage theft is a guarantee, but there's
Yes.
also the opportunity, and there were instances of sexual assault that just
Absolutely.
recreate the conditions of slavery or continue them.
Absolutely. The profound ways in which it was an understood danger that Black women faced of sexual assault, particularly in times of economic crisis. There was something called the Bronx slave market that my favorite civil rights activist Ella Baker wrote about in the 1930s during the midst of the Depression, where Black women workers would line up on streets and get picked up for day labor, and then taken, and then oftentimes not paid, or given some old clothes or old shoes or food as pay instead of money that they had negotiated for, or were simply assaulted by the people who picked them up. And again, what's profound is that we can still see open markets. If you go to a Home Depot in many states in the morning, you'll see people who are waiting for work, who are unprotected, who are vulnerable to attack, to wage theft, to any number of things. And those conditions that Black women faced then are still being faced by workers today.
We've spoken about that on this program, how really the Republicans don't actually want to stop illegal immigration, as they say, right? Because they do want a permanent underclass of workers that they can exploit. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you see parallels to the modern day a little bit with many undocumented people
Yes.
based on your research and your scholarship.
Yes. The vulnerability that Black workers have faced and continue to face are amplified for people who don't have documentation to work in this country. They are suffering from all those vulnerabilities that you could imagine because of their status, and it's really profound that we don't have a means by which to protect workers, and it suppresses everybody's wages. It makes those workers vulnerable. We need all the people who are laboring in this country to labor. Our country doesn't function without it, and so we need to find a way to make a gateway for workers to have documentation and status in this country in a way that's fair and open and available to the folks who we really still depend on.
Lastly, before I let you go, Blair, you also touch on the myth of the Trump working class voter, and there were working class people that voted for Trump, for sure.
Sure, absolutely.
But we saw this on January 6th, where like some of the most frustrating dialogue afterwards was these are, people with lots of class resentment and working class people storming the Capitol, and you look up who they were, and they own
they got hotel rooms in D.C.
Yeah, they own a pool business in Missouri. Yeah,
you know how expensive it is to get like a hotel room near the Capitol.
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
They paid for flights to come to DC to do an insurrection, and like you look up and they own a restaurant in.
Yeah. Bosses love to let employees do that.
Right. We need vacation. You need vacation time, right?
I mean, my gosh. The middle class that's full of resentment, is really the bigger part of that phenomenon. And so it was, it tickles me that, most working people couldn't afford to really take on all those challenges of the logistics of the Capitol on that day.
The logistics of a coup. Yeah, it's just that's what you get. Right, working class people can't really work through that, I guess. But I guess even more than January 6th, just if you could expand on the mythology around the Trump voter and the white working class.
Yeah, I think that as we said, the average Trump voter is a non-college educated middle class person, and the mythology that this is really about. The pain of the working class. The majority of the working class in this country is diverse, and could be benefited by the things that we're all workers of all backgrounds need. Everybody needs a higher living wage. Everybody needs protections. Everyone needs decent health care that they can access. Everyone needs assistance with housing. This is not a racialized problem. I'm writing about Black people and the ways in which they have navigated this world. But the things that those workers need benefit every worker in this country. And so, if we can get past the danger of the mythology around race and the notion of this zero-sum game that we keep staying stuck in, the country as a whole could do so much better.
Well, Blair LM Kelley, historian, Joel R. Williamson, Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, author of Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing this with us. We will put a link to your book in the description wherever you're watching or listening to this, and at majority.fm. Thank you, Blair, for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was great.